Well, hello everyone. Let me introduce myself first and then I'll get to the talk. But my name is Kevin Walters. I'm an aquatic biologist. So that means I study things that are alive and that live in the water. And I work for the state of Michigan for a department called the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. And our acronym is EGLE, which is what you see on your screen there. And today we're going to talk about invasive species in Michigan. And again, my background is mostly fisheries biology and aquatic biology. So I'm going to give a lot of examples that have to do with things in the water and aquatic invasive species, but a lot of this stuff is relevant to terrestrial invasive species or things on the land as well. So let's first take a look at a roadmap of where we'll go today. The first place I want to start is with a definition of invasive species, and I bet a lot of you guys already know what an invasive species is because it sounds like you've probably done some studying and some work on invasive species in your classrooms already, but I have a very specific definition I want to talk about. And then we'll move from there into why invasive species are bad, sort of some of the problems they cause and some of the issues we have with them. And then we'll talk about how do invasive species get to Michigan? How do they get to the Great Lakes region? How do they spread from place to place? And then we'll kind of land on what you can do to help, simple things you can do. And then I'll also have some time for questions or discussion if you guys have that at the end. So with that, let's start with our definition. What is an invasive species? And the definition I use is a definition we use in state government for my department, EGLE, and Department of Natural Resources. You may have heard of the DNR. This is the definition that we use when we're dealing with invasive species. And there's two parts to it. The first part is that an invasive species is non-native. So that means the invasive species was not normally found in Michigan or is not supposed to be in Michigan. It has somehow been introduced. It has come to be in Michigan because of a variety of methods that we'll talk about later, but it was not supposed to be or was not originally here in Michigan. And the second part of the definition is where things get interesting. And the second part of the definition is that an invasive species is not only non-native, but it also causes harm. And so the first question you may have is, what does that mean to cause harm, or causes harm to what? And some of this is based on what your values are in terms of how you think about harm. But there's three categories I'm going to use for causing harm. And the first is the economy. So an invasive species has the ability to cause harm to Michigan's economy. Meaning it can cost us money, either money to control the invasive species, money to prevent it from getting here, or money to restore things that have been broken because of things that the invasive species has done. So they cost money. Two, they can cause harm to the environment, meaning they can hurt native species, they can change the natural world and the natural environment around us. They have some sort of impact on the environment. And then lastly, there's only a few invasive species, particularly in Michigan, that have the potential to cause harm to human health. So this is kind of rare that this would happen. But I will give some examples of those so you can see what I mean by this. In fact, I'll give examples of all three of these as I move through the next several slides. The thing I want you to take home here is that invasive species is non-native, so it wasn't originally from Michigan, and then it has to cause some sort of harm, and that harm could be the economy, or the environment, or harm to human health. So let's look at some different species, some native, some invasive, and kind of talk about the differences. So this one, I bet everybody recognizes this tree, and particularly the fruit on this tree. This is, of course, an apple tree. And I have on the screen there that apple trees are not native. So they're not native to Michigan. They are originally from Europe and Asia and parts of China, and they were brought here way long ago to produce fruit and to feed people, right? To get food that we like to eat. We like applesauce, we like apple pie. Sometimes we feed animals like horses, we feed them apples, but they are not invasive. So this apple tree only fits one part of that definition. They're not native, but we don't generally think apple trees cause harm. In fact, most people think apple trees are very good for Michigan's economy. There's a lot of jobs and products produced because of apples. So we think they're actually helpful for the economy. They don't harm the environment. Apple trees are kind of good players. They stay where they're planted. They don't spread outside of orchards. They don't take over an entire orchard and prohibit other things from growing. So they're not generally considered any harm to the environment, and of course they don't harm human health either. We love to eat apples. They're good for us. They're healthy. It's a great fruit. So it doesn't fit our definition, so we don't consider it invasive, even though they are non-native, half of the definition. Here is another animal. This is a fish, of course, and it also does not fit the definition. This is non-native. It is a Pacific salmon, and specifically this is a king salmon. And as the name implies, Pacific salmon, this is originally from the Pacific Ocean. And Pacific salmon were introduced into the Great Lakes in the early 1960s for a couple reasons. One was to eat and control another invasive fish, a smaller fish called alewife. And they were also introduced because they created a sport fishery, meaning a species that we could go and fish for and enjoy fishing for and eat, and the economy would benefit from. So let's talk this one through. Not native, again, they're from the Pacific Ocean, but they are in all of our Great Lakes, these Pacific salmon. But they're not invasive because, one, they don't harm Michigan's economy. In fact, there is a multi-million-dollar sport fishery for Pacific salmon in the Great Lakes. So again, very helpful to Michigan's economy. Harm to the environment. These guys, while they do feed on some native species and some smaller fish, they do it in a way that keeps them in balance with the food web and the food chain. And so they're good players. They don't, their population doesn't take over and eat all of the small fish. They kind of stay within their niche, and they work well and work in balance in the food chain. And then lastly, they are not a harm to human health. These guys aren't dangerous to us at all. So not native, but also not invasive. It doesn't fit the definition that we're looking for. Now these, I'm assuming a lot of you guys might recognize this species as well. This is a type of bivalve or clam, so it's got two shells, and it's actually called a zebra mussel. So you've probably heard zebra mussel, and I bet lots of you know that zebra mussels are in fact invasive in Michigan. It gets its name from the black and white striping on the shells, kind of like zebra stripes. And then you'll see kind of in the upper right middle of the picture, one of those shells is turned on its side, and you can see kind of that brown stringy area. Those are called byssal threads. And they use those byssal threads to attach to hard surfaces or hard substrates. It's kind of a sticky substance on those byssal threads that allows the zebra mussel to attach and hold on very tightly. And then what they do is they attach to something, and then they filter microscopic organisms out of the water. That's what they eat, microscopic organisms in the water. So they filter it. These are actually not native to Michigan. They are native to the Caspian Sea area of Eurasia, Europe and Asia. And so they're not native. And the question is, are they invasive? Well, these guys fit our definition very well. They're not native. They cause harm to Michigan's economy. And I'm going to talk about some very specific examples in a minute. But they cost us a lot of money every year controlling and working on damage caused from zebra mussels. So they're not good for Michigan's economy. They also harm our native ecosystem and some of our native species, and I'll show you another good example about how they harm some of our native clams in a moment. And then they also have a very small potential to be a risk to human health. And I say that because if you've ever been on some of our Great Lakes shorelines that have lots of dead zebra mussel shells on the beach, you'll know that they're kind of sharp and jagged, and you could step on one and cut your foot. And I'm going to show you an example, not of a foot being cut, but a beach that is littered with shells and what that looks like and how it could potentially be a human health hazard. So zebra mussels are in fact invasive in Michigan. They are an invasive species. They fit our definition. They're not native, and they cause harm in several ways. And next we have this guy, another one I bet people recognize, and maybe some of you have even seen in Michigan. This is of course a black bear, and black bears are native to Michigan. So this is not an invasive species. It is native to Michigan. It's always been here in Michigan as far as we know, and as far back as we know, we've always had black bears. They're a native species in Michigan and an important part of our Michigan ecosystem. This is a plant species that you could probably find right now, not far from where you all are sitting or living. I've been seeing this in my backyard over the last week or two. This is a green plant that comes up pretty tall in the spring, and it flowers right about now with those white flowers. And again, even though you may not know what this is, you've probably seen this at some point over the last years. This is called garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is in fact not native to Michigan. And so the question is, does it cause harm? Is it an invasive species? It does cause harm. And the example I'm going to give here is that garlic mustard actually releases some toxin into the soil. It releases a chemical that it produces into the soil around it, and that prohibits other species of plants from growing. So the only thing that can tolerate this soil is other garlic mustard. So it creates these, what we call monocultures, so just one species covering a whole area of ground. And it is, in that way, damaging or harmful to the environment. So causes harm to the environment and is non-native. Garlic mustard is an invasive species in Michigan. And how about this guy? You guys recognize this obviously as a snake, and if you're looking in the lower right-hand corner of that picture, you'll see some little rattles on the end of the tail. So this is a rattlesnake. I wonder how many of you know whether this is native or not to Michigan. I'm going to give you the answer. The answer is this is in fact native to Michigan. This is Michigan's only poisonous snake. There's only one poisonous snake in Michigan, and this is it. It is the Massasauga rattlesnake, native to Michigan. It's usually a pretty shy snake. You will not often see these. They're kind of reclusive. They keep to themselves, usually in kind of wetland areas or just outside of a wetland, stay under logs and in brush. And again, if you were to see one of these, you wouldn't want to pick it up because they are poisonous, but chances are if it saw you, it would move away pretty quickly because they're shy. Also not a huge snake as far as rattlesnakes go. These things maybe get 2 feet long-ish. So not huge and not aggressive, but it is native to Michigan. And the cool fact is it is Michigan's only rattlesnake and only poisonous snake. So now that we're kind of familiar with the definition of invasives being non-native and causing harm, why are they so bad? Well, I think harm kind of explains that, but let's dive a little deeper into some of those kinds of harm. Again, harm to the economy, harm to the environment, and harm to human health. Let's look at some specific examples, and we'll start with zebra mussel as our featured invasive species. So this is a shopping cart that was at the bottom of Grand Traverse Bay. I don't know how long it was there, and certainly shopping carts are not normal and not supposed to be on the bottom of lakes in Michigan, but this one was, and it became covered in zebra mussels. And I'm showing you this to illustrate that, again, zebra mussels use those byssal threads to attach to any hard substrate or surface they find and totally cover it. And so that's what happened in this case. And again, shopping carts are not normal in the water. Why would this be a problem? Well, things that we do have in the water that are supposed to be there or we like having in the water are things like boats. This is a picture of a sailboat, the keel on the sailboat that hangs underneath the hull, and it provides stability and direction for the sailboat. Well, you can see in this picture, it is covered with zebra mussels. So recreational boaters and folks who even go boating for other purposes like Marine Sheriff Patrols and the Coast Guard, all those people spend time and money putting special paint on the bottom of their boats that prevents the growth of zebra mussels or slows the growth of zebra mussels. And we also spend a lot of time every year scraping and removing zebra mussels from the hull of boats, both commercial boats and recreational boats. So they cost money. They harm the economy in that way. Another way that zebra mussels cost us money and harm Michigan's economy is that they grow in water intake pipes. So pipes that are used to bring water in either for cooling an engine, like on a boat, or that deliver drinking water to homes and communities. Where I live here in West Michigan, we get a lot of our drinking water, or a lot of us do get our drinking water from Lake Michigan. There's a pipe out in Lake Michigan that brings water into a water treatment plant, and that pipe gets clogged with zebra mussels every year. And so money is spent every year to remove those zebra mussels so the water can flow more freely and more efficiently. This is a cross section or a cutaway of what an intake pipe looks like when it's infested or covered with zebra mussels. And so they, again, harm the economy by costing us money to repair some of these damages. They also harm the environment. And remember earlier I mentioned some of our native clam species are harmed by zebra mussels. Well, these two clams here, the way they function, if you know anything about clams, is they bury themselves in sand to protect themselves from predators like raccoons that love to eat clams. And they also open their shells and they stick out a little thing called a siphon that siphons or funnels water through the clam, and then they filter out microscopic organisms. That's how they eat. And you can see in this picture, both of these clams have lots of zebra mussels attached with their byssal threads to the outside of the shell. And that does two things that impact the clam. One, the clam is not going to be able to bury itself very well in the sand to stay away from predators like raccoons. And two, they're not going to be able to open their shell or send their siphon out to feed properly. So these zebra mussels are impacting the environment that way by negatively impacting some of these native clams. And then harm to human health. Again, there aren't many species in Michigan, many invasive species that are harmful to human health. But zebra mussels, when their shells wash up on a lakeshore or a beach, they can be very sharp, and you would not want to walk on this beach in bare feet. Wouldn't be very comfortable, to say the least. And in a worst case scenario, you may get some cuts or puncture wounds from some of these sharp shells. This is actually a picture from Green Bay, Wisconsin on Lake Michigan, but I've seen several other beaches around our state of Michigan that look similar to this because of zebra mussel shells, and quagga mussels, which is another invasive mussel we have in the Great Lakes. Next, I'm going to talk about giant hogweed. So giant hogweed is an invasive plant. So again, not native to Michigan, and it causes harm. I'm going to talk about the harm in just a minute, but first I want to point out in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see just how big and tall giant hogweed gets. You can see a guy standing next to it, and the plant is much taller than he is. The harm to human health that giant hogweed poses, or the risks they pose, is that they have sap inside those stems, and that sap, if you get it on your skin, and then your skin becomes exposed to UV light or light from the sun, you get a very, very bad burn, much worse than, say, poison ivy. I'm going to show you the next picture is some burns that somebody got on the back of their leg, down by their calf, by their foot. And you can see even after 8 days, the burn is very bad and swollen and blistered, and it takes several months for this to heal and can result in scarring. So you definitely don't want to mess around with giant hogweed if you see it or get its sap anywhere on your skin, because again, if it gets exposed to sunlight, it causes this burn. It's a really bad burn. Fortunately, we don't have a lot of giant hogweed in Michigan. It's known from a few locations and is actively treated and removed when it is found. So it's not very common at all in Michigan, but it is an invasive species that has the potential to harm public health. So let's talk about some other examples other than human health harm. And you may recognize this guy. Excuse me. This is called a sea lamprey, and I bet some of you have done some research or background reading on sea lamprey before. Sea lamprey are actually a primitive species of fish. It doesn't look like a fish. It looks more like a snake, but it actually is a fish. It's an eel-like fish and a long body. You can see some fins toward the backside of the lamprey in the bottom picture. But the most distinctive feature is probably that circular suction cup shaped mouth. And right in the top picture, you'll see those kind of triangular pyramid shaped yellow whitish teeth. They use the suction cup shape to attach to the side of a large fish like a salmon, or maybe a pike or even a muskie. And then they use those little yellow teeth, kind of like Velcro, to help the sea lamprey hold on to the side of the fish. And then right in the middle is the sea lamprey's mouth. And they have some kind of W-shaped teeth that they use to scrape away at the side of the fish to get through the scales, and they feed on the flesh of the fish. So they are a parasite. Now, usually the sea lamprey does not kill. It usually doesn't kill the large fish immediately or directly from attaching to it. Usually what happens is after the sea lamprey unattaches, after it's done feeding on the fish, it goes away, but it leaves this open sore on the side of the fish, which can become infected with bacteria and some diseases, and that can make the fish sick and sometimes can make the fish die. And I think what I have here next, sea lamprey is the name, what I have next is a picture of two sea lamprey attached to a trout. And you can see as a trout or a fish with sea lamprey attached, this would not be very comfortable at all. It would make swimming difficult. It would make chasing down smaller prey fish difficult. So this certainly impacts the health of the fish that the sea lamprey is attached to in that way. And then there's the scar on the side of the fish, or that open wound that I talked about that's there after the sea lamprey leaves. And again, this can become infected and also make the fish sick. So this is an example of an invasive species, the sea lamprey, having an environmental impact or a negative harm caused because of what it does and the way it feeds. This is a species of Asian carp or invasive carp, which you may have also heard about. These guys are often mentioned in the news and something we want to keep out of Michigan and keep out of the Great Lakes. And so far, we think we've done that. This particular species is called a big head carp. Big head because it has a very large head. You'll notice the eyeball is really low on this fish's head. It's kind of down at the mouth level, whereas most fish, the eye is much higher on the head. So it makes the head look large, or larger than it actually is, and they call this the big head carp. So it's one of several species of invasive or Asian carp. Some of the others are grass carp there at the top with those large diamond-shaped scales on its side. Big head in the middle is the one we just saw in the picture, and then at the bottom is silver carp. So all three of these would be invasive if found in Michigan. So they're not native here and they cause harm. Well, what kind of harm do they cause? One, they alter the food web because these all can be pretty large for fish and they take away food resources from other fish. And that's probably their biggest impact, which is an environmental impact or an environmental harm. But another harm that they could possibly have is particular to silver carp. Schools of silver carp, when they get disturbed, one of their defense mechanisms is to leap out of the water. And again, these are pretty big fish, 2 and 3 feet long and several pounds, maybe 20 pounds each, jumping out of the water when they get disturbed. You can see here a boat drove through a school of silver carp and the carp jumped out of the water. And the harm or potential harm here is that you could be hit in the side of the body or the side of your head, even though it sounds weird and maybe even a little bit funny. I wouldn't want to be hit with a large fish like this in the side of my head or the side of my body because that could certainly hurt. I think I've got one more picture. Yeah, here's a silver carp, again, disturbed, so its defense mechanism is to leap out of the water, and potentially that could cause some harm as well. So we definitely don't want these guys in the Great Lakes for a couple of reasons. One, they harm the environment. Two, there's a small human hazard as well. Here's another invasive fish that we don't want in Michigan, and I'll tell you what it's called in just a minute. But first, let's look at some of these pictures. In the lower right, you can see it has large canine or dog-like teeth, sharp teeth. So we know it's a predator. It feeds on other fish, and in fact can eat a lot of other fish. You can see how big it is in that lower left picture, and they get bigger than that even. Couple of interesting things about this fish. It is native to areas of Asia and China, and it can withstand drought seasons, so it can kind of bury itself down in wet mud even when a lake or a pond dries up and survive for several weeks to a month at a time without actual standing water by burying itself in the mud. It can also use its pelvic fins, those white fins kind of on the bottom front part of the body, to move between puddles and ponds to stay alive during drought season. So it's really adaptable and it's a big predator. So it would impact native fish populations here by feeding on them. We don't have these yet in Michigan. They are called northern snakehead, but they are in the United States in some areas. Maryland had a problem with these a few years ago where they had to go in and remove lots of these from some lakes and ponds in an area because they were causing problems. They get large. Where do they come from? These are sometimes a popular aquarium fish, so people like to buy them when they're small, put them in their aquarium and then watch them grow, and eventually they get too big for a home aquarium, and what do you do with it? Some people dump them in lakes or rivers, which is not what you should do, because then you have an invasive species that's been released. So that's not a good idea, but that's how we think they get into the environment, and how they may get into Michigan is by releases. And so this species is actually prohibited in Michigan. You're actually not allowed by law to own these anymore as an aquarium fish because of the risk that they pose to Michigan's environment. And we do have several species of native crayfish in Michigan, and these are 2 invasive species of crayfish that are now in the wild in Michigan that we're dealing with. The one on the left is called a rusty crayfish. You can see that rust-colored spot on the side of its shell or carapace right in the middle. That's where it gets its name. And The one on the right is called a red swamp crayfish. It has kind of these red bumps on most of its shell and carapace and claws. And what you should notice about these two invasive crayfish in Michigan is that they have really large claws. If these were next to some of our native crayfish, you would notice that these are larger claws than our native species have. And so they're able to be more aggressive and kind of bully our native crayfish for the best den spots and the best burrows in the banks of rivers and lakes where they live. And they also are probably more adept at catching prey because they have these larger claws. So they displace native species of crayfish. We think both of these guys probably arrived in Michigan because they're popular as bait for fishing. And sometimes they might fall off someone's hook, or maybe a fisherman, when they're done fishing and they have crayfish left in their bait bucket, maybe they dump it over their boat at the end of the day. And then those crayfish spread to a new lake or river. So not a good idea to dump your bait. So we think maybe that's how they got to Michigan, and we don't want them here because they do cause a problem. And you see I have written there common in Michigan under rusty crayfish. That's because this guy is so invasive and has invaded so much of Michigan that these are pretty easy to find rusty crayfish. Red swamp crayfish are only known from a few locations right now in Michigan, and we think the DNR has a pretty good handle on controlling or maybe even removing these completely, but rusty crayfish are kind of everywhere in Michigan and probably always going to be here now. Here's another species, kind of like garlic mustard, in that I bet you have all seen the species, even though you may know what it is. It's an invasive reed that grows in wetland areas, and it's called Phragmites. Phragmites, the word, starts with PH, so Phragmites is how you say that, invasive Phragmites, and it grows really, really tall, 10 to 15 feet tall, which is part of the problem with Phragmites. It can grow so tall that it blocks access to lakes and rivers, the ability for us to go down and go for a hike by a lake, or to go for a swim from the river. It also blocks vision along roadways so that you can't see road signs like stop signs and stoplights. And the Michigan Department of Transportation, as well as a lot of county road commissions, the people who take care of our roadways, spend a lot of time and a lot of money mowing and clearing and treating Phragmites along roadways because it's such a problem and it blocks views that make it a traffic hazard. It also is an environmental and an economic hazard in Michigan. This is a picture of the Grand River in western Michigan, where I live, kind of by Grand, taken with a drone. And what you can see is nice grassy green shoreline with some yellow trees, probably in the springtime. And you'll see a wooden dock there, a fishing pier that was built to give people access to the Grand River to fish off that dock and catch fish. But Phragmites was introduced accidentally in this area and spread to this area, and all of that gray white stuff is actually Phragmites that has grown in the river and started to take over parts of the river and reduced access for fishing. In fact, I don't think you can fish from that pier now because there's so much Phragmites there. You cannot cast your lure to open water. And so Phragmites is kind of like I said, the term monoculture earlier. It creates these areas that are nothing but solid Phragmites, 10 to 15 feet tall. So it blocks the view of the water, blocks access to the water, and becomes a real problem. Is a unique and I think pretty looking flower, and it's popular in gardens and water nurseries, probably because of those purple flowers, but it becomes a problem, or can become a problem, when it gets out into the wild beyond a water garden in somebody's backyard. This is called water hyacinth, and it has this kind of inflated area at the base of the leaves that you can see in that upper left picture. Those kind of whitish green bubble looking things kind of act like a balloon and help this plant float on the surface of the water. And so it's kind of unique. It's just, it floats there, has roots that just dangle, so it is not rooted in the mud. It floats on the surface of the water. But again, if it gets into the wild, it can cover the entire surface of the water. So this was potentially an open water area that has become infested and taken over by water hyacinth. So this picture is not from Michigan. We have water hyacinth in some places in Michigan. This is not from Michigan, but this is an example of what it can do. It can cover the entire surface of the water. And so what's the problem with covering the entire surface of the water? Well, first, imagine trying to boat or swim in this area or fish in this area. You obviously couldn't do that because there's no open water. The other problem is no sunlight is going below those plants. So any plants that are under the water, underneath the water hyacinth, they're not getting the sunlight they need. And of course, if they're not getting sunlight, they're not producing oxygen, which is what fish and salamanders and frogs and turtles and everything else that lives in the water needs to live and survive. So this covering the surface of the water totally changes the water chemistry and the way the lake functions. It's called water hyacinth. Another floating aquatic plant that's also invasive, and we do have this in several locations in Michigan, particularly southeast Michigan where you guys are from, and the Saginaw Bay area, is this plant. It's called European frogbit, kind of a weird name. It is a small lily pad looking plant, but most native lily pads in Michigan are much, much larger than this. This is a tiny little lily pad that's maybe the size of a nickel or a quarter. And you can see from that right-hand picture, it does just like water hyacinth does when it gets out into these open water areas. It covers the entire surface and blocks sunlight and changes access to the water and really can create a mess. So you don't want European frogbit in your lake or river because it changes the way the river functions and the lake functions and your access to it. Next is parrot feather. This is a really pretty bright green plant that's popular in aquariums. People will put this in their home aquariums because it's a nice looking plant. You'll see it's got these little feathery looking leaves. That's why it's called parrot feather. The problem is if it escapes from your aquarium, as it's done in the right-hand picture, it kind of starts to take over, again, open water areas, and it grows above the surface. This is a backyard community pond area that someone, we think, probably dumped their aquarium in, and a few years later, there was a big parrot feather problem starting to fill in the pond. And so that community had to get some help to have the pond treated and have the parrot feather removed. You can see on top is the before picture when parrot feather was introduced and the problems it was causing starting to fill in the pond. And then after some treatment and control, the parrot feather was removed and the water was opened up again and people have their access to the pond open again. And I think this is my final floating aquatic invasive plant that I'm going to share with you today. This one is called water chestnut, and it has these triangular shaped leaves that have the little serrations on the edge, so a pretty unique looking leaf. We don't have anything like that native to Michigan. So this is an invasive. This is not yet in Michigan. We're concerned that it might get here. And the reason is, just like with water hyacinth and European frogbit, it has the ability to cover the entire surface of open water with its leaves and, again, really change the way the lake functions and the way people are able to use a lake. So we don't want this one in Michigan either. And it is called water chestnut. And lastly, I want to give you an example of a mammal. I'm trying to run through a variety of invasive species that are some here, some not here, some concerned about getting here, everything from plants to fish to mammals. And this is the one mammal I'm going to talk about today. It is called Nutria. Kind of looks like a beaver, but it does not have a beaver-shaped tail, or maybe a muskrat, but it's bigger than a muskrat. And one of its key identifying characteristics is the bright orange teeth you can see in the lower right-hand picture there. The problem with Nutria is they'll get into wetland areas, kind of swampy, wet areas that have shallow water, and they'll root around and uproot all the plants in the area because they like to eat the roots, they like to eat the plant material, they dig around, and that's what's shown in the upper left picture is an area that's been disturbed, heavily disturbed by Nutria feeding. We don't have these guys in Michigan yet. They're kind of down south in the Gulf Coast states. We hope they don't get to Michigan either because this would be really damaging to our wetlands. But just so you're aware, there are even some mammals that could be invasive. So it's called Nutria. And then this one, insects are also invasive species or can be invasive species. This one's a kind of a shiny, bright emerald color, and it's called emerald ash borer. Got the name there. So emerald because of the color, and ash borer because it actually bores or digs holes into ash trees. And I've got a picture of an ash tree here. which we typically have a lot of ash trees in Michigan. But emerald ash borers several years ago got into the state, or were introduced into the state. And what they do is they burrow into ash trees underneath the bark, and they make these tunnels and dig out these areas of the tree, and they lay their eggs in there, and it damages the tree so much that the tree usually ends up dying. And so several years ago, Michigan lost a lot of its ash trees because of this invasive insect being introduced. Again, this one is from, I believe this again is from Asia, native to Asia, and it's become a problem here because of its impact, huge impact on ash trees. Which is a good transition into talking about how invasive species get here. How do they get to the Great Lakes? How do they get to Michigan? And then how do they move around in Michigan once they're here? And I'm gonna highlight here just 4 categories that we'll talk about in more detail in just a few minutes. So the first one is global transportation and shipping. So things moving around the globe one way or another. Another method is habitat modifications, and that one maybe isn't obvious what that means, but changing the environment outside, changing the way the earth is set up. And I'll give you some examples of that in just a minute. Organisms and trade, well, that means things that we buy and sell. Here around Michigan, here around the United States, and even around the globe, those things can be a potential risk for invasive species. And then lastly, hitchhiking on clothing, vehicles, gear, and equipment. So invasive species can, seeds or particles or pieces or even small organisms can attach to the things we wear and the things we use and the things we play with and get moved around as we use those things. I'm going to talk about some examples in each of those categories now. First, global transportation and shipping. This is a map of all the global shipping routes in the world. So every one of those yellow, brown, orange lines represents a ship moving from one port to another. And the details aren't necessarily what matters, but the big picture is that all of these ports around the world are super connected to one another because of all the things we buy, sell, and ship all around the world. And so invasive species could be one of those things that's actually getting bought or sold, or it could be hitchhiking on something that's bought or sold, or it could be in the packing material of things that are bought or sold. And likewise, airplanes move all around the world and move people and goods all around the world. So again, each one of these red and orange and yellow lines represents an air traffic or an airplane route from city to city. I'm just showing you how connected the globe is. So even though you might think something in China can't get here, or something in Australia doesn't have a way to get to the United States, there's all that water between us. Well, we're really connected by airplanes and ships these days. And habitat modification. Remember, that was the second one I talked about where I said we've changed the environment outdoors, outside around us. And the example I'm going to give here is relevant to sea lamprey. So let's pretend that each one of these red stars or red blobs is a sea lamprey in their native environment in the Atlantic Ocean, which is where they're native. And you'll see in the upper part of that map, there's a little river coming in, and that's actually not a little river, it's a huge river called the St. Lawrence River and the St. Lawrence Seaway. Well, long ago, the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Atlantic Ocean were not directly connected to the Great Lakes. There was no water flow or exchange between those areas directly. And people wanted to be able to move other people and goods between the Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes using ships and boats. So the only way to do that is to dig a canal or a ditch that water flows through and that boat traffic and ship traffic can move through as well. And so many decades ago, there was a canal system built to connect the St. Lawrence River to Lake Ontario, which is what that blue line represents, and another canal system from New York Harbor that eventually connected to Lake Ontario as well. And then a last canal system that connected Lake Ontario and Lake Erie together. And so now boats and ships and things can move between these canals, between the Atlantic Ocean and between the Great Lakes. But you'll notice sea lamprey can also now move between the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean, or rather in this scenario are coming in from the Atlantic Ocean into the Great Lakes. And as the Great Lakes become connected, the sea lamprey start to spread throughout the Great Lakes because we modified our habitat. We changed the habitat by digging canals that connected two water bodies that were not originally connected. Another example here we're going to move on to of ways things get introduced and move around is through organisms and trade. And again, remember we said that as things that are bought and sold. And in this picture, you'll see some really pretty purple landscaping plants in the foreground, and these are called Japanese barberry. So it's a really popular landscape hedge or plant, and it looks great and does well as a landscape plant. The problem is when it gets released from your yard or escapes from your yard, or maybe you change your landscaping and you dig these up and throw them in the woods behind you, what can happen is barberry, Japanese barberry from Japan, can then take over that area. This is all barberry, the pink purplish color in the woods there. And this is what happens if barberry gets released or intentionally planted sometimes, or just dumped in an area where it's not supposed to be. And the problem with barberry is it has these little tiny barbs or thorns that animals do not like to walk through, and people don't like to walk through either because they're sharp. And so deer might normally move through this wooded area pretty freely, are probably not using this wooded area at all because they don't want to walk through the barberry. So another example of organisms in trade, and we've seen some specific invasive species examples of this, is aquarium fish and aquarium plants, which are great and really fun to have at home or maybe even in your classroom. But when you're done with those fish, you know, what you shouldn't do, as I mentioned earlier, is just release them in your backyard pond, river, nearby lake. They outgrow your tank, or you just get tired of them, or you're moving. You shouldn't release them into the wild. Instead, you should call your local pet store and ask them if they will take them back. And in most cases, they will. And if they won't, they may know of somebody else who would like them or who can take them from you. So never release your pets, your aquarium pets or plants back into the wild. Always call the pet store or find some other method to dispose of them. Here I've got some photos, particularly the bottom two goldfish that you know, are not native to Michigan and were released into the wild, and a couple of colleagues here showing how big these goldfish can get and that they actually can be caught in some places in Michigan because they've been released into the wild and can become a problem in Michigan. The upper right-hand picture is that parrot feather site that I showed you earlier in that backyard pond. This is obviously before it was removed, but it shows the entire pond covered with parrot feather. And then the upper left is actually another aquarium fish species called a pacu. Kind of looks like a piranha, but it's actually a pacu that was caught in Michigan because somebody released it from their aquarium. So don't release aquarium fish when you're done with them. And that last category of how things get introduced and how things move around was hitchhiking. So kind of sometimes inadvertent, meaning unintentionally, things get stuck to our clothing or our equipment, or in this case, boats and trailers. This is a boat that I saw in West Michigan, and you can see the trailer is just covered with aquatic plants. And you can also see it's got this brown kind of funk or scum on the hull that could be lots of things. Could be plant fragments, could be larval or small zebra mussels, could be any number of things. And the issue here is if this guy takes this boat from one lake and goes to another lake later that afternoon, or maybe the next day, or maybe several days from now without cleaning this stuff off, they may be moving plant material and whatever else is on the hull of that boat from one lake to another and introducing new things that weren't there originally. So that's a problem, and that's how things hitchhike from one place to another. And this can also happen on the land. You know, things we use like bikes and ATVs and shovels and tractors and all kinds of things that we move around can also harbor or hold invasive species hitchhikers. Things like these seeds that are stuck into the rubber tires of this bike. And then another example is firewood. You can see insect holes here from insects that have burrowed into this firewood and are now hiding or hitchhiking in this wood. And maybe this isn't a problem if this was a tree you cut down in your own backyard and you're burning it there. But imagine if you had plans to go camping in Maine, say this summer, and you took firewood that looked like this from your backyard out to Maine. You may be introducing whatever insect this is from Michigan to Maine, which would be a problem. And so why is it important to do something about invasive species? Well, first let's talk about why it's important, then I'm going to give you some tips on what you can actually do. And to talk about why it's important, I'm going to take you on a little time trip, or a trip back to 1988, before any of you were born. And we're going to talk about this and talk about this little scenario. So in 1988, Snapple was first introduced, and the first flavor they ever had was lemon iced tea. That was back in 1988 when Snapple was invented. The #1 show on television was The Cosby Show in 1988. Doppler radar, that kind of swirling image you see on the news weather of greens and reds and blues, it's called Doppler radar, and it was first introduced in 1988. CDs, you guys probably don't even use CDs anymore, but CDs first overtook vinyl records in sales in 1988. So music was the most popular method of getting music in 1988 was CDs, compact discs, and the most popular movie was Rain Man. 1988 was also the last year that you could visit a Great Lakes shoreline in the absence of zebra mussels. So we think zebra mussels first came to the Great Lakes probably around 1988, and that was probably the last year you could go to a beach in the Great Lakes and not find zebra mussel shells somewhere. So they are now just about everywhere in the Great Lakes and pretty easy to find. And so these are good reasons why preventing things from getting here in the first place and preventing things from moving to new locations is really important, because once an invasive species gets here and becomes established, like zebra mussels, it's very hard to get rid of them and very hard to control them, and a lot of times impossible to get rid of them. The example I like to give is toothpaste coming out of a tube. If you squeeze a whole bunch of toothpaste out of a tube, you're not going to be able to get that toothpaste back in. And that's kind of the case with things like zebra mussels. The toothpaste is out of the tube. We're never going to be able to get rid of zebra mussels. So we need to prevent what may be the next zebra mussel from getting to Michigan. Another reason why it's important to do something is because they cost us so much money. $20 million a year in the Great Lakes is spent to control sea lamprey. $25 million a year is spent in Michigan on aquatic nuisance plants, things like invasive Eurasian milfoil in that picture, and $10 million a year to control the impacts of zebra mussels, like clearing out water intake pipes. So they're very expensive. Well, what can you do as a student to help, as a young person? This is what I do to help. This is me as an aquatic biologist, kind of the goals for our program, which are too detailed and something we don't need to get into today. The things you can do are very simple. Things like cleaning, draining, and drying boats, trailers, and fishing gear. So if you go fishing with your dad or your mom or your uncle or your cousin, or your own rowboat on your backyard pond, and you're gonna take it out of the water, make sure when you're done, you clean it. So remove all the aquatic plant materials and any other debris and stuff that's not supposed to be on it. Drain it, pull out drain plugs, run your bilge pump to pump out the water, and just remove all the water in the boat and trailer, and then dry it. Take a towel, hand dry it, let your gear dry for a few days before going to the next lake or river. That way you're doing the best you can to prevent moving and transporting invasive species as you go. And this applies to things we do on the land, like using our ATVs or our bikes, which I have in the next picture. We say play, clean, go for things on the land. So play with your bike, go out and ride and have fun. When you're done, clean it off, give it a quick brush off, pull things that aren't supposed to be on your bike, your boots, your shoes, leave it where you were using it, and then go home. So play, clean, go. And again, maybe the scenario of you biking at a neighborhood park and then coming home isn't that big of a deal in terms of moving things around. But imagine if you were to go and take your bike this summer on a camping trip to say the Grand Canyon in Arizona. When you're done in Arizona, you would definitely want to clean off your bike tires and your hiking boots and your pant legs, because you don't want plant species or seeds that are in Arizona to make their way back to Michigan. You never know what could be invasive or what you might be hauling with you. So really important, play, clean, go, and clean, drain, dry. And then lastly, use local firewood. So the example I gave earlier was taking Michigan firewood to go camping out in Maine this summer. Instead, just wait till you get to Maine and buy firewood there. Local firewood that was trees grown and cut in Maine. So you're not bringing anything new with you. Use local firewood. You're not transporting insects that might be hiding in that wood. And then lastly, if you have home pets or even classroom pets like turtles or maybe crayfish, when you're done with those in your classroom or you're done with those at home, again, don't release them into the wild. Don't dump them into a pond or wetland that might be on the school property. Instead, give your local pet store a call and see if they can help you dispose of them properly. Well, that's what I have for you guys today. I really appreciate your time. I thank you guys for listening and inviting me to talk, and hope it was informative and entertaining.